probably worth just mentioning that this is the first of two sessions on regulation and guidance. So this one before lunch is focusing on the current situation, and the one after lunch is looking at gaps and how they might be addressed. So we can have got a couple of hours to talk about these issues, I guess. Okay, so I want now to invite the four people who are going to give responses or talk about regional considerations. So Claude, I think you're first. Do you want to come on first? So yeah, I think it's good if everyone. Yeah, please.
I think I'm going to introduce myself first. Yeah, I'm Claude Chirumuhuzia from Uganda, Kampala International University. And my talk is going to be on the East African regional guidelines, the ethics guidelines, vis-a-vis what we are talking about. I'm not going to present any slides because we are required to give like a response to Dr. Riak's talk. So I reviewed guidelines for East African countries, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, and Tanzania. And the first impression I got is that there is no explicit reference to alternative trial designs when you look at the guidelines. So they are not mentioned anywhere, meaning they are based on traditional clinical trial designs. The randomized clinical trial design are the gold standard, meaning that everything they do is based on that. And when you go deep, you find that these guidelines, they serve as the basis for the following. Evaluation of research protocols is based on those guidelines. Recruitment of REC members, the IRB members, is based on their guidelines. Recruitment of participants and community engagement is based on their guidelines. Informed consent process is based on their guidelines. Compensation guidelines are based on what they have written down, and even formulation of their standard operating procedures. So if these guidelines are not referring to alternative trial designs, so how are the RECs approving the protocols? Do they have the capacity? We have seen the training is based on the guidelines. So if we presented an alternative like the stepped wedge design protocol to a REC in Uganda, would they approve it? Or they would say, you are bringing complicated situations here. I think we are not approving this. Because how are you going to explain the informed consent? How are you going to run the informed consent process? Because according to our guidelines, according to our standard operating procedures, your design is complicated. We are not considering it. So you find that there are lots of gaps that we need to address. If you go the infection models we have been talking about, there is no clear reference to these models. So bottom line is that the guidelines, although they are based on international guidelines, in this region, they are based on international guidelines, WHO, CIOMS, we don't have specific guidance on how we can handle these alternative trial models. So as a way forward, we need reviews. And after reviewing these guidelines, this is what I proposed, that there is a need for review of these guidelines. But before we review the guidelines, or alongside, we need also to interact with the regulatory body members, the RECs, because we have regulatory bodies at different levels in these countries, from the national level downwards. We need to know what they think. So there is a need to have qualitative studies, get the attitudes. In addition to looking at the practices, we also need to get the attitudes of the members of the regulatory bodies before we bring this. What do they have to say about it? Are they welcome? Because we might say we are changing the guidelines at international level, but how about the responses we would have from these people? So there is a need for qualitative considerations, maybe some kind of study amongst the regulatory body members, RECs, and also the higher levels, to find out what do they think about it, in addition to reviewing the guidelines. Then finally, we can do the revision, but after considering what they think, in addition to the results that we have seen. So I will not go deeper than that. I've just given you a brief overview. The most important thing is that the guidelines are silent about the alternative trial designs. Second thing, all the activities are based on the current guidelines they are having, and that implicitly indicates that there is no capacity to give appropriate reviews, leave alone, because after the review and approval, you are supposed to monitor. So how would they monitor such trials if they don't have any guidelines? So I'll leave it at that and give my colleague from the Caribbean also to give the situation there.
Thank you very much, Claude. And now I want to introduce Derek Aarons, who's from the Caribbean Public Health Agency.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Now, I endorse the major point made by our colleague Raike that very scant guidance currently exists on alternative clinical trials, methods, and designs, and the various associated ethical issues. However, while interest in alternative research designs may well be growing in some low and mid-income countries, a similar awareness, interest, as well as expertise is currently lacking in most countries of the Caribbean. Now, where does specific guidance exist? We have heard of the CIOMS Guidelines 20 and 21, as well as the Ottawa Statement. We should, however, note that in describing some of its limitations, the authors of the Ottawa Statement admitted that no chair of a research ethics committee from any low or middle-income countries took part in their discussion that led to the consensus statement. And so the perspective of low and middle-income countries were underrepresented in that particular guidance. We should note in particular that CIOMS Guideline 20 and Ottawa Statement assume that the reader knows all the requisite background details about alternative designs to put into context what is being said. However, the reality for us in the 24 member states of the Caribbean is that the broad concepts about alternative trial designs have not been introduced to most of our stakeholders in research. With a little introductory training in cluster randomized trials is currently being conducted in the Masters in Epidemiology course at the University of the West Indies, no training in the other alternative methods designs is currently being done. Most importantly, Research Ethics Committee members who will have to evaluate any submission for research using these alternative designs have not received even cursory instructions in these designs. In regard to CHIMS, whilst the WHO document does not prohibit conducting such research in low and middle-income countries, as these studies invariably involve greater than minimal risk, such research with the relatively research-naive inhabitants of the Caribbean will require special efforts to ensure that the participants' consent is truly informed. Further, in our relatively impoverished countries in the Caribbean, the concept of a healthy volunteer being provided an incentive to participate would beg the ethical question of what quantum of payment would change the variable from being an incentive to being an undue inducement to participate in the research. In addition, the pervasive low educational levels across most of our Caribbean countries pose challenges for full comprehension regarding the concept of a vaccine and distinguishing between its role of prevention as opposed to one of treatment, and the concept of a placebo and the process of randomization. Further, while most developed countries have research regulations, only 2 of our 24 member states in the Caribbean currently have any regulation to protect the participants of research. Where local expertise does not exist to properly evaluate alternative research designs, and research regulation does not exist, there may be a greater risk of exploitation and non-compensation when harm from research occurs. Now, you may propose that the solution to some of these challenges may lie in the research being conducted in a north-south collaborative approach, but still there will be a challenge in meeting the requirement of CIOM's Guideline 8, which requires that proposed collaborative research be ethically reviewed in both the sponsoring country as well as in the host country. Our research ethics committees in the Caribbean would need update training in these alternative designs to facilitate their ability to ethically review such proposed research. As a corollary in this regard, Reiki has suggested that local research ethics committees should be encouraged to develop relationships with research ethics committees that have experience with research using controlled human infection models. So, practical challenges exist in virtually all Caribbean countries for the reviewing as well as the conducting of such research, and consequently, much more guidance and capacity building in comprehending and ethically reviewing the various methodologies and the merits of the various alternative research designs will be needed before such research endeavors are likely to be accepted as being scientifically valid by the various researchers and stakeholders in research within the Caribbean region. These are my thoughts on the matter. Thank you for your kind attention.
Now I'd like to invite Carla Sainz from PAHO to come and give us her thoughts.
I'm afraid I'm not tall enough for this podium. We just saw only Catherine's eyes a moment ago. I'm not going to reproduce that for you. So, sorry, Catherine. So I'm going to speak here. So, yeah, that's more enough. Very expressive eyes, I agree. Oh, thanks. So, when we started discussing the topic of this meeting, I did a little bit of an inquiry with my colleagues from the region. I talked to scientists, ethicists, members of ethics review committees, health authorities, regulators about their experience with these novel study designs. And one thing that they almost unanimously said is that they see them as challenging because of the lack of relevant local expertise. So they say they come to us ready, they're enlatados, canned. So we don't produce them and we feel uncomfortable reviewing them. And I was asked to explain what the situation is in terms of regulations. So no specific regulations addressing the characteristics of these designs exists. But I want to argue that that's not a problem. We don't need the regs to cover every type of study method or study design. What we need, I think that the job of analyzing these studies is better done by ethics review committees on a one-to-one basis and using the available ethical guidelines, which brings me to another problem that ethics guidance, as we have discussed already, is not always sufficiently available. It's not always as detailed as we would like it to be It doesn't necessarily cover all the aspects on which we may have questions, and it's not always sufficiently known in the region. One thing I particularly worry about is that, like every situation in which we face something new, we claim that an entirely new set of guidance is needed. So one thing that I think is important to remind ourselves about is that a lot of, I mean, yes, there are peculiarities about these novel trial designs and methods, but there are many things that are in many other studies. So there's a lot that can be extrapolated. So it's not that we need a completely, say like a museum's guidelines document, right? So that's the first part of what I wanted to share with you. The second part of my comments to these discussions from a regional perspective is, as it were, a continuation of a conversation that many of the Latin American participants of the 2015 Global Forum that took place in Annecy had. So the point is the following. We think that, or at least many of us have discussed, that the discussion about how these studies should be done should be preceded by a discussion of why these study designs are needed or preferable. And many of us worried that some judgments were made a little bit too quickly in response to the Ebola outbreak, and that we need to revisit that discussion. That in the heat of the moment, it was assumed that X is unethical and X is unfeasible and X is not supported by the population were synonymous. So we need to take a moment to do the job of analyzing what exactly is unethical, because it can be the case that something is ethical and not feasible, or something is ethical and feasible and still not supported by the population. So we have the duty as experts to bring clarity to that discussion, and we need to do it now before we face another emergency. However, one thing that I want to notice is that in the discussion in these 2 days, we have, as it were, kind of like shifted the general framing of the conversation. So we went from introducing the discussion of these novel trial designs and as a way to bypass certain problems. We went from that to, no, we don't need to bypass any problems. Those are the best trial design from a scientific perspective. And I'm still a little bit confused about that. I'm not convinced that that is the case, but I'm an ethicist. I think that well, we need a little bit more clarity to be completely convinced of that claim. At any rate, what I want to highlight is that shift in the conversation does not imply any claim about those initial problems that we wanted to bypass. So we said before, because X is problematic, therefore we should do Y. Because these other studies are problematic, we should do this other type of studies. So now we're saying, no, we need to do this other type of studies because they're scientifically the best way to go. And even if we agree with that, that doesn't mean that we're agreeing about the initial claim about X. I think that's still something that we need to discuss.
Thank you. Great, thanks. Thank you very much, Carla. Now our final speaker for this session, Cristina Torres, is going to speak from the FERCAP perspective. Maybe you want to.
Good morning. I come from the Forum of Ethics Review Committees in Asia and the Pacific. So we are a regional organization of ethics committees, and I would like to present my personal reaction to the question that has been posed to us. The question is, are there ethical guidelines in the region to address the use of innovative design? So first, I would like to highlight the current landscape in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of researches being done in the region. There's a high level of awareness about ethical issues in research. FERCAP alone has visited about 230 ethics committees. There are continuing initiatives towards capacity building and strengthening of Research Ethics Committee. There are National Research Ethics Committee accreditation in place in specific countries like the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia. There's the existence of in-country national guidelines and regulations, and there are ethics networks within the country, and there are opportunities for discussion and knowledge dissemination during regional conferences, international conferences. So it is a very vibrant landscape for ethics in the Southeast Asian region. So what are the gaps and challenges? No? So the question is there need for separate guidelines about innovative design versus using general ethical guidelines or currently available international guidelines and its application to innovative design? Do we need to come up with new guidelines that would be very specific to the region? That's the question I'm raising. Or shouldn't there be a focus on ethics capacity building rather than coming up with new guidelines? Because developing approaches for ethics capacity building would mean that you make it cope, you make them be able to handle the innovative designs that are currently available. There will always be innovation in research. And I think that the guidelines should be able to cover this, but what is important is the application of the guidelines. So the research ethics committees know how to apply the guidelines that are already currently available. And then the other point that I would like to emphasize is context. I think for research ethics committees, context is very important. What are the context-specific issue? Are we in a low or middle-income country, or do we operate on a high-income country? The context is going to be different, and therefore the ethical issues are going to be different. The application of vulnerability is going to be different. The application of risks and benefits are going to be different. So context is very important, I think, in the analysis of protocols and in the analysis of new innovative design. So, in relation to research ethics methods, how should ethical issues be applied within the specific context of a region or of a country? So context and the different nuances have to be recognized. What is the difference between practice and research? Probably in a low and middle income country, this comes as public health practice. It is not taken up as research. Or it may be a policy rather than research. So the distinction has to be recognized so that we do not overburden the ethics committee and we do not take up issues that are beyond the scope of the ethics committee. The other issue is about the kind of participants. Are the participants individually recruited? Or is it community-based, such as we see in cluster randomized trials? So again, the context of the research is going to be different, and therefore, how is informed consent going to be done? How is recruitment going to be done? We just do not say that because it's cluster randomized, we will approve a waiver of consent. It depends. No? So it is protocol specific rather than coming up with a general guideline that in CRT, we will waive consent. So again, the other issue is the difference between biomedical and public health research. And this brings us to the issue of the difference between an efficacy study, which is a drug development method, as different from effectiveness study. Effectiveness means how is the health system effective in bringing about a new intervention that will prevent disease or that will redound to common good. It's very important that we understand the difference between efficacy and effectiveness, because the clinical equipoise is going to change. No? So we know that this kind of strategy is good, but the clinical equipoise is what is the difference between two communities that's going to undergo the same intervention. It still is clinical equipoise, but not about efficacy, but it is about effectiveness. The other issue is being able to differentiate. Are you only doing an observational research, or are you doing an intervention research? Are you administering drugs, or are you just observing how drugs are being administered? The risk and benefit issues are going to be different. Consent forms are going to be different. The social value is going to be different. The scientific rigor is going to be different. And then, yesterday we had discussion about gatekeepers. No? Who is the gatekeeper? It may be a formal gatekeeper, but sometimes it is an informal gatekeeper. And in social behavioral research and community research, it's very important that we are able to identify both the formal and the informal gatekeeper. Otherwise, we will encounter problems later on. And of course, the issue of, is it community consent, or is it individual consent, or should you issue a waiver? In SIOMS, it's very clear that in doing community researches, first you get permission from the community, and then you do individual consent. So waiver of consent does not apply all the time. So I'm raising these challenges because I think these are the issues that ethics committees grapple with. And if we are able to do training, if we are able to do capacity building so that we are all familiar with the ethical challenges of innovative design, I think it will be much better than coming up with new guidelines that would be very specific and very parochial, meaning that it's only a country guideline or it is only one region's guideline. Thank you.
So I think we have about 10 minutes for questions, which is a great way to start off a conversation which will continue after lunch. So I'd like to open up the floor for questions or comments relating to any of the presentations so far. Everyone's tired. Yeah. Would anyone on the panel like to say something?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to throw a stone in the crowd and see the reaction. And it is on this issue of equipoise. When we are doing clinical trials, there is usually a preclinical stage when information is given before you can introduce the drugs into human beings. But when we go to equipoise, we know there is that uncertainty on either side. When we are doing adaptive trial designs, the issues they are raising that once you get some information, then you are disturbing the equipoise and changes should be made. But even when you are using the traditional randomized clinical trial, there is no absolute state where you are saying we don't have any data. We are starting from this point. At any given moment, there is some level of information. So, can't we do away with the equipoise issue and then we bring other ethical principles, but we leave it out of the situation? Since at any given moment, especially when we introduce products in humans, we already have some information.
Comments on that, or are people ready for lunch? Looks like people might be ready for lunch. Oh, sorry.
I know Ricardo wanted to make a point, but I just wanted to emphasize something that Dorcas said earlier that raised the broader issue of what should the focus be in lower and middle-income countries. Much of her presentation this morning and some of the points that we've made thus far in our discussions emphasizes the importance of informed consent. My own bias is that whilst informed consent is important, as low and middle income countries and as research ethics committee members, we should focus more on the issue of justice. That even where informed consent exists, our role is to protect, and this drives home the point that Fee Young was making earlier, that a lot of our population are vulnerable. And so even if they volunteer, we also have to protect them against unnecessary harm. And that's where the issue of justice comes in, and that should be our driving motivation. The challenge for us in the Caribbean is that most of our countries, research ethics committees, do their work without any regulatory framework. So when they prohibit or they disapprove of research, the researcher can still go ahead, and there's nothing that can be done in terms of regulation or penalties. And so we also have to look at, all we're discussing with the context is, does the regulatory system support the work of research ethics committees? And that is very important for us in low and middle income countries, where we have not developed that framework to the point where it is robust and can support all the work that's been done in research. Those are my thoughts on that matter. Dorcas wishes to respond.
Thanks very much. So, got a comment from the back, and then Paul, and then maybe we should stop for lunch.
Well, you know, with this raising interest in this kind of different approaches for trials, it came from recent emergencies. But we are not like discovering something new. If you see these kind of studies are not like something that somebody discovered in the last couple of years. It's something that has occurred through several decades. However, there are very few people that is knowledgeable about this kind of designs, because they are far more complicated than the traditional designs. So the people is getting in kind of inertia of, okay, let's do whatever we do is usual, is the traditional, because it's easy, we don't need to think about it. And it's only in these emergency cases that we think, okay, there are some people that do something that is a little bit different and can be useful, and we should go back to these designs that are, we call alternatives. So probably this is a good opportunity for us to make a call and say, you know, there is not alternative designs. There is proper designs for proper scientific questions. So we should choose the design that is more appropriate to answer the question, not because, and not choosing the design because it's easier, because it's what we know, but it's because it's the best suitable design for getting the knowledge. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think the final comment should go to Paul Ndebele, the back there, and then I've just remembered that I'm supposed to be encouraging people to look at the posters after this session, so perhaps you could have a quick look at the posters before lunch. Thank you. So Paul.
Yes, thanks very much. I think with multi-country studies that involve African countries, we have realized some serious delays in terms of processing of research in lots of African countries due to some of the challenges that we have been observing. But I'm just going to highlight some of the initiatives across Africa, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa at the moment, that are aimed at ensuring that we improve the situation. I can start off by highlighting the AVAREF, which is the African AIDS Vaccine Regulatory and Ethics Forum, which is coordinated by WHO Afro Office. So far, there are 26 member countries in AVAREF, and the members consist of research ethics committees and also the drug regulatory authorities in the 26 countries. And AVAREF has set a deadline of 60 days for the clearance of clinical trials through the member countries. And they take various steps aimed at facilitating this, including joint reviews of the countries involved in those clinical trials, and also facilitating consultations. And of course, through the research which was being conducted on Ebola. They also are looking into issues of speeding the processing of research proposals in emergency situations, such as in the case with Ebola. But also looking at the continent level, at the African Union level, through NEPAD, we have an initiative which is called the ARACO Centers, where some national drug regulatory authorities and also research ethics committees have been declared centers of excellence, either in ethical review and pharmacovigilance for the drug authorities. So it actually means that those that are declared centers of excellence can serve as resources for those that would want to learn, so they can actually facilitate some chores by ethics committees and also drug regulatory authorities from the weaker countries to those that have some strengths. Recently, last week or so, EDCTP had a call for proposals for drug authorities and also ethics committees, and they were actually encouraging countries to include budgets for the visits to the ARACO centers. But I also want to highlight one initiative by the HIV networks funded through the NIH. They've realized also that it's very, very important to bring together ethics committees and drug regulatory authorities from time to time, so that they discuss some of these challenges, particularly in the area of HIV vaccine research. And we realize by bringing these together, it actually smoothens the processes. One last component that I would touch on is the various FOGAT-funded training programs that we have across Africa that could also assist in addressing all these issues, because that presents an opportunity for the strengthening of research ethics committees and also even for enlightening our researchers on the various issues that we have been discussing during the past 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. So I'd like to ask all of you to join me in thanking our speakers. So please, as I said, please do take time to have a look at the posters during the lunch break, and look forward to